Shemai. Welcome to our evening of stories woven with music. I'm Deb Winter. This is Holly Robinson, and I am delighted to be here in the wonderful Queen's Hall, and a huge thanks to Lara, the Queen of Queen's Hall, and her magnificent team for helping to keep performance going. It is a slightly strange thing, of course, for a storyteller to be telling her stories to an empty hall, team accepted. In fact, storytelling live, I'd often say to the audience, you know, you are the most important part of the evening, because without your listening, I'm just a mad woman talking to herself in an empty room. Well, that has come true tonight. I'm not going to say very much about the stories themselves, because there's a wonderful saying from the Jewish tradition that if I told you a story and then explained the meaning, well, that would be like giving you a piece of meat or a particularly crunchy nut burger and chewing it for you. So all I'm going to say is that I've chosen 3 very different stories for you, 3 contrasting moods. So hopefully one at least will chime with your mood. Your mood, she says, addressing the invisible person on their settee, which, yeah, I can just see the Newcastle crowd. You're still in the kitchen making cups of tea. Can you hurry up now, because we're starting soon? The only other thing I need to tell you is that the title piece of the show, The Raven and the Rock, is the 3rd story, because I'd hate you to spoil your enjoyment of the pieces by sitting there thinking, well, there's not many ravens and rocks in this story. But actually, Raven does make a fly-past appearance in the first story. To be honest, it's quite difficult to keep him out of things, because after all, as you know, it was Raven who created the world. This story starts with anger. Anger as fierce as the freezing wind that blows across the tundra. So much anger rising inside this father that he drags his daughter to the edge of the cliff and pushes her off into the wind. Her arms flail. There's nothing to hold on to. And down she goes. Down, 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 until she hits the sea. The freezing water is like an icy hand clutching her heart, gripping it. She can't breathe. The sea drags her under, and down she goes again. Down, down, down. Tugged this way and that way by the currents. Drifting. Floating. Down, down, down. Until finally she settles on the soft bed of the ocean. Her flesh becomes food for the fish. Barnacles make a home on her bones. So long she lies there that her tribe, her people, quite forget what she had done wrong, or whether she had done any wrong at all, whether she had simply been wronged. The story dissolved like her flesh until there was nothing left but a skeleton. Nothing much changed in that place of rock and ice and wind. The people lived by fishing. Their lives were ruled by the wind and the tide. The catch was everything. Their lives depended on it. One man fished alone. A tough, taciturn, solitary man, hard as a crab on the outside, tender and hungry inside. He fished from a kayak with a rod, a gut line, and a bone hook on the end of it. One day, having no luck at all in the place he was fishing, he decided to paddle round to a little further round the coast, to a deep bay where he'd never fished before. Just as he was letting his line into the water, a black cormorant flew past low across the sea right by his kayak. Now he would have luck. The sea raven. If the raven god favoured him, he would be lucky. He would eat well that night. And that very moment, his line tautened, a catch already. And he began to pull happily on the line. Eagerly, he leant down to see what he had caught, what was coming up. Down below, skeleton woman sat up, yanked to a sitting position by the bone hook around her ribcage. Unaware, the fisherman pulls on the line, brings his catch to the surface, and hey! A bony, eyeless skull comes over the edge of his kayak. He leans back in horror, but as he does, up come the bony hands, as if the bony fingers are trying to clutch on the rim of the kayak. Aye, some sea demon wanting to eat him alive. In sheer terror, he grabs the paddle, he bats the bony skull. Skeleton woman falls back into the water. And now, fixing the line in the bottom of the boat, he grabs his paddle and he paddles furiously for the shore. He's never paddled so fast in his life. But when he glances fearfully over his shoulder, she's following him still, her bony arms flailing on the surface of the sea, her bony head bouncing along just behind the boat. He's never paddled so fast. He's never got that kayak up on the shore so fast. And now, grabbing the precious line, he runs as fast as he can, hurtling across the hard ground, across the icy tundra. He doesn't realize she's following him still. Her poor bones rattling and clacking and clacking and rattling over the hard ground. He dives through the tunnel of the snow house like an Arctic fox going to ground. And he lies on his bed in the darkness, his heart beating, pounding, his pulse racing. And he lies there until his breathing calms. And now, calm, he feels for his whale oil lamp. He cuts off a small piece of hair to make the low flame flare up. The light flickers, and there, right next to the bed, is the eyeless face looking right at him. But still, and then he sees the poor tangle of her bones below. He sees the bone hook caught in the rib and understands suddenly the reason for the mad chase across the sea, across the land. Sees she is no sea demon, no monster. just a poor human like himself. And now, looking at her, he begins to wonder how she had come to lie so lonely at the bottom of the sea. And now, some motherly instinct in him to somehow put things right, or at least to set things straight. He begins with his leathery, calloused, hard fisherman's hands. He begins to work at the puzzle of her bones, delicately picking out the bony heel from the rib cage, lifting the bony foot away from the elbow. He works patiently until he has set her straight, every bone in place. And gently, pleased with his work, he props her up against a pile of seal skins. And he does what he would do for any human visitor. He wraps her round with furs to keep her warm. And then some childlike instinct in him. He cuts off 2 hanks of his black, glossy, fish-oiled hair, and he ties them round that poor bare skull with a strand of seaweed that had come trailing with her foot. Now she looks almost human, companionable even, there in the lamplight, almost as if he had a wife there with him in the snow house. But now, exhausted from the furious paddling, he drops into a deep, deep sleep. But as he sleeps, he dreams. He dreams of a woman falling, of a woman drifting down, down, down through the deep green water. And over again he dreams of her drifting, pulled this way and that by the currents, down, 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 until she settles on the soft bed of the ocean. And in his sleep, in his dream, he feels such sorrow for the woman. And out of the well of his compassion, and also out of the well of his own loneliness, a single tear rolls down his cheek. And Skeleton Woman, propped up against the furs, sees that tear. She leans forward. She drinks the tear. And the tear flows through her body like a life-giving river. And in her great thirst, she drinks and she drinks and she drinks from that river. And as she does, she feels the strength coming back into her bones. And with that strength, she leans over and plunges her hand into the man's chest, draws out his heart. Doo-dum, doo-dum, doo-dum. And she began to beat on that heart as though it were a drum. And then in in a voice that had laid at the bottom of the sea for a long time. She began to sing. She sang the flesh back onto her bones. She sang the muscles back into her body. Una muna, una mama, una mana, una mana. She sang all the soft parts that made her a woman. Shuma, 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 shake, shake, shake. And then, best of all, she sung herself a new heart. No me hama, ho, ho, ho. No me hama, ha, ha, ha. And with her new heart, with its rhythm of its own, she no longer needed the heart of the man. And she placed it carefully back into his body. And then, with all the hunger of a strong young woman, with all the hunger of any human who has not known love, she dived under the furs to be with that other human body, flesh to flesh, bone to bone, spirit to spirit. And in the morning, another tangle of limbs. But this time, such a happy tangling. And though much of the story has dissolved, has been lost, they say that for all their lives, that man and that woman, they were never short of love or fish. I'd like to dedicate that retrospectively to Claire and remind her that her tribe loves her very much indeed. That was an Inuit story, generously shared by an Inuit woman with a writer and researcher, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who made that story well known, shared it with millions of women through her book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. But a story of great healing, I think, for men and for women. And I'm trying to resist the phrase, and now for something completely different. For a complete contrast, this time, this story started as a Scottish story. But, stories have a habit of travelling. This story hopped on the ferry with me to Ireland. And, it seemed to like it over there. It settled down quite nicely in Ireland, so now it's an Irish story. Well, for tonight anyway. I do have to just give you a little warning. If you've got any small children who've steadfastly refused to go to bed, no matter how much you've cajoled them, or if you have a particularly squeamish boyfriend or anyone with you, I'd just like to give you a warning. When I get to the part in the next story where I say the temperatures are plummeting and the snow's freezing on the ground, you might like to go and get some socks Well, you could put them on if you're feeling cold, if I manage to make you feel cold. But the idea is that you just stuff the socks in the ears of the small children or your squeamish partner, because just for about a moment, and then all will be well. Right, over we go to Ireland. Whether it's a pandemic or a potato famine, the poor always bear the brunt of any hard times a country is going through. And it's a hard fact of life. If you can't pay your rent, you're out. And that's what had happened to Pat. Pat had a job on a farm. The farm failed. He couldn't pay the rent. The landlord gave him 24 hours to pack up his things and be out of his home. Tell the truth, Pat didn't have much to gather up. He left that cottage with just the coat on his back and his most precious possessions in a strong leather bag. His most precious possessions. Into that bag he put 2 chisels, a wood plane, a wood saw, a hacksaw, a hammer, a box of nails. You see, Pat was a handy man. He was handy with his hands. He could turn his hand to any kind of job, fix anything, and this was what was going to save him. And so Pat did what many an Irishman had done. He took to the roads, tramping the roads, knocking at every farm and every cottage, asking for work in return for a supper and somewhere to lay his head. Well, it wasn't a bad life in the summer. He was handy. He got plenty of work. Sometimes he just got stale bread and a bit of milk to soak it in. In the poorer houses, they shared generously with him. They gave him more than they were eating themselves, even if it was just potatoes. So he did okay in the summer. But you can imagine when the rains of autumn came and there was less work around. It was miserable. Now, Pat wasn't getting enough work to eat properly. He was getting thinner. But worse than that, his boots were getting thinner. He had holes in both his boots. And if you have ever walked in through puddles, and rain, and as winter came on, mushy snow, you'll know that your woolen socks soon become wet and they never dry out, and it's a miserable thing. And then, as winter drew on and the temperatures plummeted, Pat had an empty belly. And one night, he couldn't get work, he couldn't get a warm barn to sleep in. He slept in a derelict, abandoned cottage. There were plenty of those. But when I say slept, he laid awake all night. He was so hungry. It was a hard, hard frost again. When he set off down the road, cold and hungry, the sole of his right boot only chose that day to come adrift from the upper. And it began to go slap, slap, slap along the hard, icy ground. Cold and miserable, he trudged along, when suddenly he heard a much lighter tread behind him, a tapping, a running, and he looked round, and there was a tall young man trotting to catch up with him. He came alongside of Pat and said, "Do you mind if I walk with you a little bit of the way?" "Well, no, I'd be glad of the company," said Pat. He couldn't help but notice, keep looking at, the man had a bundle under his arm, something wrapped in cloth, and he couldn't help blurting out, "Is that your dinner in that bundle?" in a hopeful kind of a way. "In a manner of speaking," said the man, and he opened the bundle, and there was a fiddle. He said, that's my dinner, all right. He said, I'll play for anyone, a wake or a wedding or a farm, anywhere they like a bit of music. That's my dinner, all right. Well, the two men in the same boat decided to walk along together. But as they walked along, the slap, slap, slap of the sole on Pat's boots, Fergal looked down and he said, your boots are in a bad way. I'm in a bad way, said Pat. And just at that moment, the road turned the corner. You're not as in a bad way as your man, said Fergal. And there, on the frosty bank, laid an old man, looking up at the sky. His beard was as white as the frost, frozen solid with quite a covering of snow on him. Is he, said Pat, and Fergal went forward and he gently touched the man's cheek. He's frozen solid. Could have been there a few nights, I reckon. There's nothing more we can do for him. And he went to move away and Pat to follow him when suddenly Pat spotted the man's boots. Oh, the most beautiful leather boots, almost new. Some farmer's widow must have handed over her husband's nearly new boots, and they were exactly his size. He looked longingly at the boots, and then he went to unlace them. Fergal, oh, you're not. He's no use for them now, said Pat. And look at me. I can't walk barefoot in this weather. But when he gave the boot a tug, it was frozen solid to the man's foot. Well, there's nothing to be done, said Fergal, and he went to move away, and Pat went to follow him, and then, wait a minute. He had an idea. And he rummaged in his bag, and oh, you're not, said Fergal. And Pat brought out his hacksaw. Now, at this moment, I would normally ask a live audience for a sound effect at this point. But I've got to say, I'm always really worried if anybody actually knows it. Moving swiftly on. The job was done, the men moved swiftly down the road, and that bag was heavy now, with all those tools and the frozen feet and boots with them. And Pat was so glad when Fergal spotted a farm and he knocked on the door. The farmer's wife answered, and Fergal said, we're two young, strong men who'll turn a hand to any kind of a work in return for a good supper and somewhere to sleep. And besides, he said, I'm Fergal, the best fiddle player this side of Galway. And if you'll give us a good meal, then I'll play for you as long as you like. Well, said the farmer's wife, we like a bit of music in this house. And she called her husband. And her husband came to the door and he had a bandage round his arm. And he said, oh, I've had a bit of an accident. I could do with some help, to be honest. This peat needs digging, this ditches need digging, if you don't mind working really hard. Well, the two lads worked hard for the farmer all day. And in return, the farmer's wife gave them such a meal as Pat had not seen for a long time. Beef, stew, and dumplings, and potatoes, and bread, and all manner of filling things. They ate their fill. And afterwards, Fergal got out his fiddle. And he played for them such sweet, such sorrowful, such melancholy tunes that they were all really happy. afterwards the farmer's wife led the men to where they'd sleep. Just the barn, she said, but there's piles of straw there that you can dive in. You'll be roasty toasty because just behind is the cow byre. And their warm, sweet breath, it soon warms the place up. Just a word of warning, she said. Whatever you do, she said, and she pointed to a wooden door with a bar across it. She said, whatever you do, don't open that door. And there was a kicking sound, something kicking against the wood. She said, one of the cows has gone mad. I don't know what happened, but yesterday she started biting and kicking the rest of the herd. Well, you saw my husband's arm. When he went to try and stop her, she only took a big chunk out of his arm. He's going to have to shoot her. But he can't bring himself to do it, so he's locked her in there just for tonight. Well, you could hear that cow kicking. And if it hadn't been for the fact the men were exhausted from all the digging they'd done and had such full bellies from such an amazing meal, they would have been awake all night. But as it was, they nestled down in that straw. They put their heads on their backs. They were in sleep in no time at all, despite the kicking from the cow. A little while before first light, Fergal suddenly woke up, sat bolt upright, for the cow was kicking in a frenzied way. Bang, bang, bang. But the minute he sat up, what is that nauseating? What is that most disgusting smell I've ever smelled in my life? And it was coming from Pat. And he looked down and he saw Pat's head on the back, and then he remembered the feet, which had thawed in the warm breath of the cow. Well, I'm not staying in this barn a moment longer. Your man can catch me up down the road. And he grabbed his bag and his coat and he ran out of that place in the darkness. Pat slept on, but the cow was becoming ever more frenzied, kicking, kicking, kicking. And he woke up, and he too, what? And then he remembered, my boots, the boots. And he opened the bag, completely thawed, and he shook the feet out onto the shore and he put the beautiful boots on, and he was just standing admiring them when suddenly there was a splintering noise and the bar gave way and the cow came charging out of the stall, and she too, that smell. And being curious, she ran straight to the source of the smell, and being curious as cows do to see if it was edible, she took out her tongue and she was licking the foot. And just at that moment, the farmer's wife came running into the barn to call the two men from their porridge. And what did she see? Not two men, but one man, and a pair of rather chewed-looking feet, and a cow mouthing those feet. And she screamed and she dropped onto her knees and she clutched Pat's trousers. Oh, don't be telling anyone. The mad cow has only gone and eaten the fiddler. Oh, don't be telling the authorities. My husband will go to prison. We'll lose the farm. Well, there's a time to tell stories and there's a time to keep quiet. Pat said not a word. Oh, she was so grateful. You'll come and live in the house with us, as long as you promise never to tell anyone about the fiddler. Come and live and be like a son. Well, she was as good as his word. Pat moved into the cottage. He ate like a king. He worked hard for the old couple as well. And they had no children. And they came to love him like a son. And when they eventually passed away, well, they signed over the farm. They left the farm to Pat. And Pat, who had been homeless and cold and hungry, had a home of his own at last. And he was able to send for his village sweetheart. And they got married and raised a family. But I tell you, for as long as he lived, Pat slept with those boots under his head, under his pillow at night, and every night before he went to sleep, he kissed those boots. And now we come to the third story, The Raven and the Rock. And sometimes my introductions sound like a story in themselves or a little bit of a digression, but I promise you this isn't one, really. And the way this story came about, the idea for telling the story in this particular way, was that I'd been listening to, a radio interview, and it was between someone who was arguing the case for genetic modification, somebody from the agrochemical, the farming industry, and he was arguing with someone from an environmental protection lobby, and who was concerned about genetic modification. And the first man, a little patronizingly, I thought, said, you know, when we make a change to the seed, it's as if you took the Bible and you just changed one letter. Imagine all the letters in the Bible, and all we're doing is changing one letter. Well, quick as a flash, the chap came back at him. What difference can that make? Well, thou shalt now kill. I thought that was quite clever, and I'd been thinking about COVID, because that word we're so sick of hearing, COVID, COVID, COVID. And this set me thinking that all you'd have to do is slip one little letter into that word. If we just slip the letter R in, then we end up with corvid. What a beautiful word. Corvids, crows, rooks, jackdaws, and the raven, the magnificent raven who features in so many stories. And I'm lucky enough to live in a place near high cliffs and lonely crags and there's two ravens live above the cromlech and a rocky crag above my house. And I started reading more and more about ravens, and I came across a beautiful word that the Irish use called raven sight. And I'm not going to, some of you will know, but I won't say what it means. It's a lovely thing to look it up. And I've taken poetic liberties. But the idea of raven sight inspired me, and I do like to work outside, so I was just, I do a lot of just wandering around the countryside, talking to myself and muttering. And as I was chewing over this particular story at the cromlech above my house, the raven suddenly came out of the cloud with his hoarse gronk, that hoarse croak, and it just gave me a way in to this story. If, like me, you haunt the wild places, the rocky crags, the lonely stones, then you'll know Raven. Know his hoarse croak as he sails out of the cloud. And that he's black, powerful, free, freer than we are. And that black eye, centuries old, seeing everything. From up here where Raven flies, how tiny men seem. Little rows of ants marching off to war, scuttling to bring in the harvest before it rains. From up here, something catches Raven's eye. A sudden flash of light, the glint of sun off a steel visor. And down there is a tiny little king, waist deep in the unlucky dead. Raven and his brothers will feast on their flesh that night on the battlefield. And so they call him the bird of death, the bird of ill omen that haunts the gallows pole, waiting for a meal. But to be fair, think about it. Raven didn't start the war. Raven didn't build the gallows pole. Down there, the young king throws down his sword. He's sick of war, thrust into war against his inclination by the murder of his father. 2 invaders, 1 usurper, 3 years of it. But it's finished now, thank God. The men can return to their farms and their wives, and the young king returns to the court. And peace, as you can imagine, floods the land with joy. And when young King Orfeo goes back to the court, such celebrations for the feast, for the peace, such feasting, such music. For young King Orfeo loves music above all things. For 3 years, he's heard nothing but the drums of war, the percussion of steel on steel, and he longs for the sweet sound of the harp again. He longs to take up his own beloved instrument, the crwth, and longs to play it, for he's got the gift. He's got the gift. When he plays, the sound is so sweet, they say that young women and young men fall in love with him, that old men and old women cry, and that babies stop crying. The court fills up with music now that Orfeo is home. Drawn by the music is the woman who loves to dance, the Lady Lara, so full of light and laughter and life. She dances late into the night. She falls for this man that is made of music. She dances late into the night. She dances her way into Orfeo's heart. Her mind dances too. She beats Orfeo at chess every single time. He curses her, he kisses her, he marries her. It's a true love match. The wedding celebrations go on for weeks. Another excuse for feasting and music and dancing. And the queen, new Queen Lara, she orders so many dances that they rename the great hall of the castle after her, and forever after it is known as the Queen's Hall, famous for superb musicians and the wildest dancing. Now, on the day the trouble began, and without the trouble, there would be no story. It was a hot July day. The heat shimmered over the meadows. The queen was walking in the rose garden. She had danced half the night away. Her head was heavy. The heat seemed to throb and pulse in the air. She made for the orchard. She lay down in the shade under the old apple tree. There was a steady drone, a buzz of bumblebees, and it lulled her into a deep sleep. When she woke, there was a young knight sitting on the grass next to her with his back up against the apple tree. He offered her a golden goblet, and She, on the hot day, thinking kind Orfeo had sent some refreshment for her, she took the goblet and she took a mouthful and, oh, her head began to spin straight away, and a strange sensation crept through her body. It was the strangest, strongest, sweetest drink she'd ever drunk. And now she looked at the knight more closely, she realised she'd never seen him before. Young, long, glossy blue-black hair and skin so pale it was almost blue, and eyes as darker than she'd ever seen. He offered her the goblet again as she hesitated, but she couldn't resist, and she drained the goblet to the dregs. And straight away the orchard began to spin. The apple tree began to dance. She fell asleep, a deep swoon it seemed. When she woke, the knight had vanished, and her head was full of trouble. That night, when she got into bed with Orfeo, Orfeo was distracted. He'd had business of the court all day, meeting after meeting. Fortunately, not on Zoom as it hadn't been invented, but all the same pesky, bothersome meetings, matters of tax and revenue and management and legal matters. He was distracted, but even so, he couldn't help but notice that Lara clung onto him tightly, as if she was afraid of drowning or that wild horses would drag him away. And when she finally fell asleep, she was tossing and turning and talking in her sleep, rambling wild, incoherent words. Hard to make out what she was saying, but then the words he did catch stopped his heart, for she spoke of a tryst she must keep with a knight tomorrow. In the morning, Orfeo is formal and cold with his wife, icily polite. Lara is confused. She knows. She who's always been so free, gone her own way, knows she will go back to the orchard to look for the knight. She feels the summons in her very blood. And when she steps out of the castle into the grounds, she finds her husband has set an armed guard on her. They follow her everywhere. They follow her through the meadows, through the rose gardens. They follow her every step. And those steps take her back to the orchard, back to the apple tree where she had met the knight. There was no one there, but she knew somehow he would come. And she lay down on the grass to rest, tired after her troubled night, and fell asleep. The 12 knights made a tight ring around her, guarding her, their swords unsheathed and ready to see off should any stranger approach as Orfeo had ordered. Orfeo, working again, but he's distracted, he can't settle. And after an hour, he comes running to the orchard. The 12 knights are still there in a circle, but fast asleep on the grass. The orchard is empty. No one there but a raven. The grounds are searched, the castle's searched, the meadows are searched, the woods are searched. There's no sign of Lauren, no sign of the Queen at all. 3 days they search, 3 weeks, 3 months. And there's not a clue, not a sighting, not of the Queen or of her abductor, lover. So many questions, and now Orfeo heaps hot coals of blame onto his own head. I should have talked to her. I should have listened. I should have asked her what was wrong. She was troubled. She seemed strange, afraid. She was afraid of something. Tormented by unanswered questions and bereft of the loss of his wife. Orfeo simply walks away. He leaves his kingdom in the care of his most trusted friend, his steward, and he simply walks away, taking nothing but a blanket and his beloved Cruth for comfort. And he walks away from the safety of the castle. He even walks away from the safety of the town, through the woods, and away he goes, walking up onto the wilderness of the moor. And it's a bleak, desolate place, a place of relentless rain and creeping mists, place of stunted, twisted thorn trees, of peaty, boggy, dark places, of treacherous ravines and gullies. It's a lonely place, and Orfeo has never felt more alone. And he lives in a cold cave, foraging in the woods for comfort, foraging for food, keeping himself warm with armfuls of bracken. He lives in a cold cave and he becomes unkempt, long, shaggy hair. His clothes become torn and dirty. As the years passed, he's unrecognizable, more like an outlaw than a king. And he does nothing but play the songs of lost love. He plays such sorrowful songs. For 30 years, 30 years, he lives on the moor playing the songs of anguish. Songs so sad that the clouds cry into the heather, that the wind sighs with longing, and yet so beautiful. They say that the very rocks gave up their nature and melted in bliss to hear his music. The streams that ran down the moor changed their course to draw near and listen to his music. And that the lonely thorn trees uprooted themselves to come and take solace in his music. And then one day, everything changed. Orfeo suddenly realizes he is not alone. Whilst a busy and important king, nature had been simply a backdrop to his own busy life. But now, living on the moor, living with nature, in nature, it's as if he's seeing her, hearing her for the first time. She speaks to him through the waterfalls, through the splashing of the stream where he and the deer drink together. He watches her ways. He learns the secret ways of the fox, the shy ways of the wren. He gets to know each bird, to recognize the kestrel from her sudden drop, the speckled thrush from her strange jumping steps. He watches and wonders at the miracle of the toad, sleeping out the winter, buried under the soil, heartbeat slowed down into a slow, strange winter coma. When he was a king, he'd never taken much notice of Sir Beetle with his metallic suits of armour. But now he lies on his stomach for hours and watches and marvels at the iridescent green metal of the beetle, the blue, the gold, the scarlet. So tiny and yet so beautiful. Misty morning, Orfeo is standing alone by an ancient stone, and suddenly the raven flies out of the cloud with that hoarse croak, and suddenly, in that moment, all are one. Orfeo knows, he feels. They are all one. The raven, the cloud, the stone, the ground. There is no separation. He is the raven and the rock and the cloud and the water. And in that moment, Raven lends him raven sight. Raven who flies between both worlds, the one we see and the one we don't see, lends him raven sight. And in that moment, suddenly, the world is luminous. It's as if he's had cataracts removed. The thorn trees seem to dance. The colours are so bright. Something catches Orfeo's eye. The raven flies down into the gully. He follows the flight, and there is a gash of scarlet. He scrambles down the scree slope. Halfway down, and there at the bottom of the ravine, half veiled in the white mist, he sees white horses, a line of white horses, 24 white horses, and on their backs, finely dressed ladies in scarlet cloaks, each with a hawk on their shoulder, a hunting party. At the front, a woman, her face turned away, is looking up at the sky. She raises her arm. Her hawk drops straight as a stone onto her gauntlet, and then she turns back, and as she does, Orfeo stumbles in shock. It can't be. Before he can even call out, she rides her horse straight at the rocky wall of the ravine and vanishes into it. And as he stands there with his mouth open, all the riders follow, riding at the rock and disappearing. And now Orfeo, without a shadow of a doubt or trace of disbelief in his mind, runs at the rock. which melts like candy floss. He finds himself in a dark, rocky tunnel. It's icy cold. He can hear the echo of the horse's hooves ahead of him. He stumbles along, feeling his way, feeling the clammy, cold water of the cave. The misty moisture in his beard freezes in it. It's so cold, he seems to walk forever, chilled to the marrow. But ahead, he sees a flicker of fire, flaming torches, and suddenly the tunnel turns a corner, and he finds himself in a great high-ceilinged cavern, furnished like a room. The walls are hung with cloth of gold, and the room is full of beds. Beds covered in gold candlewick covers, and in every bed a sleeper. He can hear the deep breathing. It's the middle of the day. It's so strange. And he walks through. They can't see him, they can't hear him. No one stirs. He walks down the tunnel, comes into another room full of beds, men and women asleep. Room after room full of sleepers. It feels so strange. On and on he goes, room after room, until the last room. There are the 24 ladies, already in their beds, their scarlet cloaks lying on the ground next to the bed and right in front of him. Yes, the Lady Lara, as young and lovely as the day he'd married her, sleeping. His eyes fill with tears. He reaches out to touch her, but expecting his hand to go straight through her body. But no, she's warm, warm flesh, and he can't resist, and he bends to kiss her. She doesn't stir. He shakes her gently. Nothing. He shakes her roughly. He shakes her fiercely. He cannot wake her. This is no natural sleep, and he knows he must find whoever holds her in thrall. He's been aware of a faint strain of music, strange tune. On he goes, more rocky corridors, and as he follows, the music seems to be leading him. Louder it gets as he goes forward until he comes to 2 great oak doors. The great hall of this strange underground palace. This palace where his queen has been living all the time under his feet. One of the doors is ajar. He peers through. Creatures of such strangeness. Not unlike mortal men, but sharp-featured. There are ears rising to a point. And wings folded up their back of black crow's feathers, and they're all dancing. A strange dance. And puckish eyes all turn towards him, and the music screeches to a halt. And the elvish creatures part like the Red Sea. And at the top of the hall, he sees him, the young man with the long, glossy, blue-black hair. And there he is, the great deceiver, the conjurer, the one who conjures up those deceiving mists, the illusions, the one who manufactures unreliable gold, the one who steals us away from our own lives, offering us strange drinks and potions. The one who offers us shortcuts to paradise, opening doors to other worlds. And he speaks. We seem to have ragged company. Orpheo's mind races. I am no beggar, sire. I am simply a wandering minstrel. Now, I have heard that you and your people prize music. I have come to play for you, to seek your favor, to earn a gift, a boon. I may look like a beggar, but my playing pleases kings. A bold claim. Well, let us see what you can do. So Orfeo draws the crwth from this leather bag, and he begins to play. And he plays a song of great longing for his lost wife. For a while he has been living on the moor, it has filled him with music, with its own music. Orfeo plays the songs of the wind in the trees, the songs of the tumbling crows, the swooping falcon, the fleet deer and the running hare. As he plays, the feet of the fairy creatures cannot stay still. And they dance, they gambol, they caper until they can dance no more. And the king, the black night, the dark night, who has had his eyes closed, watching the dreams that dance on the insides of his eyelids, spoke. You spoke truly. Your music has moved me. You have earned a gift, a boon. Name whatever you want and you shall take it. There is no shortage of gold here. Lara, the dark night frowns. He realizes he has made a mistake. Lara, his favorite. But a promise is a promise, and in that place cannot be broken. Very well, she is free. The spell is broken. She is free to choose whether to stay with me in paradise or to leave with you. And look at yourself, ragged, dirty, old. Orfeo bows and he runs like a madman back down through the maze of tunnels, corridors to find Lara. And he kneels at her feet. They don't speak a word. There are no words for such moments. She takes his hand, and together they run back to the upper world, the mortal, sunlit world. And as they emerge from that dark place back into the beautiful world of sunlight, the spell is broken. And the spell that has kept the hand of time from marking the queen is broken, and time now carves 30 years on her face in deep lines and furrows. She is no longer young and lovely. And Orfeo kisses the furrows of that face with all the fervour of a man who has not held his wife in his arms for 30 years. Such rejoicing when they return to the court, such music, such dancing. The queen hires so many minstrels and pays them handsomely. Such parties. You should have been there. I was there, telling the story of the raven and the rock and everything else. Holly was there, making everybody dance. And Raven? What of Raven? Well, Raven just watches us as we sleepwalk through the world, seemingly blind to its beauty, falling for all the great deceptions, chasing fool's gold. Raven just watches us, wondering when we will wake up and save this earthly paradise. I hope you've enjoyed this journey that we've been on together. Thank you.